The Valkyrie Empire had ruled the stars for 12,000 years. Their ships were the fastest. Their weapons were the deadliest. Their soldiers were the most feared in the entire galaxy. Every species knew the name Valkyrie, and every species feared it. Supreme Commander Zethrak stood at the center of the High Council chamber, his tall scaled body casting a long shadow across the polished floor. Around him sat the 12 counselors who controlled the empire. They were old, wealthy, and very proud. They had never lost a war. They did not believe they ever could. "The humans have crossed into our territory," Zethrak announced. His voice echoed through the great hall. "Their colony ships have settled on 3 planets in the outer reach. They did not ask permission. They did not send diplomats. They simply took what they wanted." Councillor Veth, the oldest member of the council, leaned forward in his chair. His scales had turned gray with age, but his eyes were still sharp. "What do we know about these humans?" Zethrak waved his hand, and a holographic image appeared in the center of the room. It showed a human warship, a small vessel made of gray metal with simple engines and basic weapons. Compared to the sleek golden ships of the Valkyrie, it looked like a toy. "They are primitives," Zethrak said with a sneer. "They have no shield technology. Their weapons are simple projectiles and low-grade lasers. Their fastest ships can barely reach half the speed of our slowest transport vessels. They are not a threat. They are an insult." The counselors murmured among themselves. Some laughed at the image of the crude human ship. Others shook their heads in disgust. "They must be taught a lesson," said Counselor Myra, her voice cold and sharp. "No species expands into Valkyrie territory without consequences. If we allow this, others will follow. Our reputation must be maintained." Zethrak nodded. This was exactly what he wanted to hear. "I propose we send the Grand Armada, 3,000 warships. We will destroy their colonies, capture their home world, and add them to our list of conquered species. The war will be over in 3 rotations." The vote was quick. All 12 counselors raised their hands in agreement. War was declared. The greatest military force in Valkyrie history would be assembled and sent to crush the human race. What the council did not know, what Zethrak himself could not have imagined, was that their own fleet had already been lost. Not to battle, not to sabotage, but to something far more patient and far more dangerous. Aboard the flagship Eternal Dominion, Commander Elisa Morgan sat alone in her small quarters. She was human, one of hundreds who worked throughout the Valkyrie military. Her official title was Navigation Consultant. She helped plot courses through dangerous space, guided ships through asteroid fields, and trained young Valkyrie officers in the art of stellar cartography. The Valkyrie trusted her completely. She had worked for them for 15 years. She had saved the flagship twice during pirate attacks. She had earned medals and commendations. Captain Varath, the commander of the Eternal Dominion, considered her one of his most valuable crew members. He had no idea who she really was. Lisa read the declaration of war on her personal screen. The message had been sent to all crew members, announcing the glorious campaign against the human invaders. It described the primitives who dared to challenge Valkyrie supremacy. It promised quick victory and eternal glory. Lisa smiled and set down the screen. She walked to her door and pressed her hand against the lock. A hidden panel slid open, revealing a second communication device. This one was not connected to the Valkyrie network. It used a frequency the Valkyrie had never discovered, a channel that connected her to every other human embedded in their fleet. "Mrs. Morgan," she said quietly, "the declaration has been made. Begin Phase 2. Across the Valkyrie Armada, 412 humans received her message. They were engineers who maintained the great warships. They were pilots who flew supply shuttles. They were mechanics who repaired weapon systems. They were instructors who trained Valkyrie officers in everything from combat tactics to basic ship operation. For 3 generations, humans have been coming to Valkyrie space. The first had arrived as refugees, desperate workers seeking employment in the great empire. The Valkyrie had welcomed them. After all, humans were willing to do jobs that Valkyrie considered beneath them. Cleaning engine rooms, maintaining life support systems, running diagnostic checks on weapons arrays. The second generation was born in Valkyrie space. They grew up speaking the Valkyrie language, understanding Valkyrie culture, learning Valkyrie technology. They became more valuable, taking on more important roles. The Valkyrie noticed that humans were good workers, reliable, efficient, never complaining. By the third generation, humans were everywhere in the Valkyrie military. They knew every ship, every system, every weakness. They had trained the pilots who now flew the warships. They had built the engines that powered the fleet. They had written the code that controlled the weapons, and they had been waiting for this exact moment. Lisa Morgan was third generation. Her grandmother had arrived on a refugee transport 50 years ago. Her mother had been a bridge technician on a Valkyrie cruiser. Lisa had grown up surrounded by the enemy, learning their ways, earning their trust, climbing their ranks. She was not a servant. She had never been a servant. She was a soldier, planted deep in enemy territory, waiting for orders that had finally come. The Valkyrie thought they were going to war against a primitive species with crude technology and weak defenses. They imagined easy victory, quick conquest, and another name added to their list of defeated enemies. They did not realize that the war was already over. They had lost it years ago, the moment they decided that humans were beneath them, the moment they let strangers into their ships and their systems and their trust. Lisa walked back to her bed and lay down. Tomorrow would be a busy day. There were final preparations to make, last messages to send, coordinates to confirm. The Valkyrie Armada would jump to human space in 72 hours. They expected to find a frightened and outmatched enemy waiting for them. They would find something very different. Lisa closed her eyes and slept peacefully. She had waited her entire life for this. A few more days meant nothing. Patience was something humans understood very well. The Valkyrie were about to learn that lesson. They were about to learn it in a way they would never forget. 50 years before the Valkyrie declared war, a young man named Kevin Price stood before the United Earth Defense Council. He was only 32 years old, a junior strategist with no combat experience and no famous family name. The admirals and generals who sat before him were not impressed. "You want us to send our people into enemy territory as workers?" Admiral Sandra Cole asked. Her voice was heavy with doubt. "That sounds like surrender, not strategy." Kevin shook his head. He had expected this reaction. He had prepared for it. "Not surrender, Admiral. Investment. The Valkyrie are powerful, but they are also lazy. They hire other species to do work they consider beneath them. They trust outsiders with their ships, their technology, their military secrets. This is a weakness we can use." General Marcus Webb, the oldest man in the room, leaned back in his chair. "Explain." Kevin pressed a button, and a holographic display appeared. It showed the Valkyrie Empire, a vast stretch of stars covering nearly a quarter of the galaxy. Human space was tiny by comparison, a small cluster of colonies on the edge of explored territory. "We cannot defeat them in open battle," Kevin said. "Their fleet outnumbers ours 50 to 1. Their technology is centuries ahead of ours. If we fight them directly, we will lose. Everyone in this room knows that." The council members shifted uncomfortably. No one argued. The truth was obvious. "But the Valkyrie have a weakness," Kevin continued. "They do not value labor. They do not train their own engineers or mechanics or technicians. They hire other species to do those jobs. And they trust those workers completely, because they cannot imagine that anyone they consider inferior could ever be a threat. Admiral Cole frowned. You want to infiltrate their military. I want to become their military, Kevin said. Not with soldiers. Not with spies. With workers. Engineers who maintain their engines. Pilots who fly their supply ships. Instructors who train their officers. We send our people in as refugees and laborers. We let them become essential. And then we wait. Wait for what? General Webb asked. Kevin smiled. For them to make a mistake. For them to threaten us. For them to give us a reason. And when that day comes, we will already be inside their fleet. We will control their ships. We will know their systems. We will have everything we need to win without firing a single shot. The council debated for 3 hours. Many called the plan insane. Others called it cowardly. But in the end, they had no better options. The Valkyrie were too powerful to fight. Running was not possible. Hiding would only delay the inevitable. They approved the plan. They called it the long game. The first humans arrived in Valkyrie space 6 months later. They came on refugee ships, pretending to flee from wars and disasters that had never happened. The Valkyrie accepted them without question. Workers were always needed. Humans were cheap and willing. Lisa Morgan's grandmother, a woman named Helen, was on one of those first ships. She was 23 years old, newly married, and terrified. She had volunteered for the mission, knowing she might never see Earth again. Her husband, a man named George, came with her. They told themselves they were doing this for their future children, for their species, for a world they might never return to. Helen got a job cleaning engine rooms on a Valkyrie cargo ship. It was hard work, dirty work, work that no Valkyrie would ever do. But Helen did it without complaint. She learned the language. She studied the technology. She made friends with other workers and slowly began to understand how Valkyrie ships really worked. George became a maintenance technician on a space station. He learned to repair shield generators and weapons arrays. The Valkyrie engineers who supervised him barely paid attention. They assumed he was too stupid to understand the complex systems he was fixing. They were wrong. Within 5 years, Helen and George had moved up in the ranks. Helen was now an assistant engineer on a Valkyrie warship. George was a systems specialist at a military repair facility. They had access to classified technology, secure communications, and detailed plans of Valkyrie weapons. They had a daughter named Carol. She was born in Valkyrie space, grew up speaking their language, attended their schools. She learned to act like a servant while thinking like a soldier. By the time she was 20, she was training Valkyrie pilots how to fly their own ships. Carol married a human engineer named Daniel Morgan. Their daughter was Lisa. Lisa never knew any home except Valkyrie space. She grew up surrounded by the enemy, eating their food, following their customs, pretending to be grateful for their charity. But every night, her mother would tell her the truth. She would explain the mission, the purpose, the long game that their family had been playing for 2 generations. "You are not a servant," Carol would say. "You are a soldier. Never forget that. One day, you will have a chance to prove it. Be ready." Lisa was ready. She studied harder than any Valkyrie student. She trained longer than any Valkyrie officer. She became the best navigator in the fleet, so skilled that Captain Vorath specifically requested her for the flagship, Eternal Dominion. The Valkyrie thought they had found a loyal worker. They gave her medals and bonuses and praised her dedication. They invited her to their parties and treated her almost like an equal. They never suspected that she was counting their ships, mapping their defenses, and reporting everything to Earth. Kevin Price, now an old man with white hair and tired eyes, received her reports from a hospital bed on Earth. He had devoted his entire life to the long game. He had watched 3 generations of humans sacrifice their freedom to serve the mission. He had buried friends who died in Valkyrie space, never able to return home. But the plan was working. 400 humans were now embedded in the Valkyrie military. They controlled critical systems on nearly every major warship. They knew codes and protocols that the Valkyrie themselves had forgotten. They were ready. When news came that the Valkyrie had declared war, Kevin smiled for the first time in years. The moment he had spent his life preparing for had finally arrived. He sent one final message. To Lisa Morgan, "You have authorization. Show them what humans can do." Lisa received the message and began to move. The seeds planted 50 years ago were about to bloom. The harvest would be something the Valkyrie never expected. The long game was over. Now the real game would begin. The Valkyrie Armada was the largest military force ever assembled in the history of the galaxy. 3,000 warships, each one a masterpiece of advanced technology, emerged from subspace at the edge of the Sol system. Their golden hulls gleamed in the light of the distant sun. Their weapons hummed with deadly energy. Their crews stood ready for the glory of conquest. Supreme Commander Zethrak stood on the bridge of his command vessel, watching the human solar system appear on his tactical display. Earth was there, a small blue planet orbiting an ordinary yellow star. It looked fragile and weak, like something he could crush in his hand. "All ships report ready," his communications officer announced. "The fleet is in formation. We await your orders, Supreme Commander." Zethrak allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. This would be easy. The humans had no real defenses. Their fleet was tiny, their technology primitive. He would destroy their colonies first, then move on to their home world. By this time next week, the human species would be conquered, and his name would be remembered forever. "Begin the advance," he commanded. "Destroy anything that moves." The Armada began to move forward. 3,000 ships flying in perfect formation toward the inner planets. Zethrak imagined the terror the humans must be feeling. He imagined their primitive sensors detecting his fleet, their leaders panicking, their people crying out in fear. Then the first explosion happened. The warship Crimson Flame, positioned at the front of the formation, suddenly erupted in a ball of fire. There was no warning, no incoming attack, no enemy weapons. The ship simply exploded from within, killing all 800 crew members instantly. Zethrak stared at his display in confusion. "What happened? Report." Before anyone could answer, 2 more ships exploded. Then 5 more. Then a dozen. Across the Armada, warships were dying without any visible cause. Engines overloaded. Reactors melted down. Weapon systems detonated in their own base. On the Eternal Dominion, Captain Vorath screamed for answers. His bridge was in chaos. Warning alarms filled the air. Officers shouted conflicting reports. The ship shuddered as its main engines suddenly shut down. "Engineering, what is happening?" Vorath demanded into his communicator. There was no response. He tried again. Still nothing. The lights on the bridge flickered and went out. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting everything in a dim red glow. The main view screen went dark. Navigation consoles stopped responding. The great flagship of the Valkyrie Empire was now drifting helplessly through space. "Someone tell me what is happening," Vorath roared. A calm voice answered from behind him. "I can explain, Captain." Vorath spun around and saw Lisa Morgan standing at the entrance to the bridge. She was holding a plasma pistol, and she was not alone. Behind her stood a dozen humans, all of them armed, all of them wearing the uniforms of Valkyrie crew members. "Morgan?" Vorath stared at her in disbelief. "What are you doing? What is the meaning of this?" Lisa walked slowly toward him, her weapon pointed at his chest. Her face was calm, almost peaceful. This was the moment she had trained for her entire life. "Captain Vorth, I am hereby relieving you of command," she said. "This vessel is now the property of the United Earth Government. You and your crew will be treated as prisoners of war in accordance with human military law." Vorth's scales turned pale with shock. "You cannot do this. You are a servant. You are nothing." Lisa smiled. "I was never your servant, Captain. I was your enemy. My family has been your enemy for 3 generations. We worked in your ships. We maintained your engines. We trained your officers. And now we are taking everything you gave us access to." Across the fleet, similar scenes were happening on every ship. Human engineers shut down reactors and locked out command systems. Human pilots took control of navigation computers. Human technicians disabled weapons and sealed bridge doors. The Volcari crew members, confused and unprepared, could do nothing but surrender. Admiral Christopher Lane stood on the bridge of the Earth vessel Resolute, watching the chaos unfold on his tactical display. He had expected a battle. He had prepared for casualties, for sacrifice, for the terrible cost of fighting a superior enemy. Instead, he was watching the greatest military force in the galaxy tear itself apart from within. "Admiral," his communications officer reported, "we are receiving transmissions from the Volcari flagship. Commander Morgan reports she has secured the bridge. Captain Vorth is in custody." Lane nodded slowly. It was working. The plan that had taken 50 years to build was working perfectly. "What are our orders, Admiral?" his executive officer asked. Lane thought for a moment. The Volcari Armada was crippled. Hundreds of ships were drifting without power. Others had surrendered to their human crew members. Only a few dozen vessels were still fighting, their Volcari officers desperately trying to regain control. "Move in and assist our people," Lane ordered. "Any Volcari ship that surrenders should be secured. Any ship that resists should be disabled, not destroyed. I want prisoners, not corpses." The Earth fleet moved forward. They were still outnumbered, but numbers no longer mattered. The Volcari crews were trapped on ships they could not control, surrounded by enemies who knew every system and every weakness. By the end of the day, 2,700 Volcari warships had been captured intact. 200 more had been destroyed when their crews chose to fight rather than surrender. The remaining 100 had managed to escape, fleeing back to Volcari space with news of the impossible disaster. Lisa Morgan stood on the bridge of the Eternal Dominion, watching Earth grow larger in the view screen. She had never seen her species' home world before. She had only heard stories, only seen pictures, only dreamed of the place her grandmother had left so many years ago. It was beautiful, small and blue and fragile, just as Zethrak had thought. But it was home. It had always been home, even when she lived among the stars. "We did it," she whispered to herself. "We actually did it." The first battle of the war was over. The humans had won without losing a single ship. And the Volcari Empire was about to learn that the servants they had trusted were the deadliest enemies they had ever faced. The news reached the Volcari High Council like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. Supreme Commander Zethrak stood before the 12 counselors, his scales pale and his voice shaking. He had escaped the disaster aboard one of the few ships that managed to flee. Now he had to explain how the greatest military force in Volcari history had been captured by the very workers they had hired. "This is impossible," Counselor Veth said. His old voice trembled with anger. 3,000 ships, the finest warships in the galaxy, captured by servants? Zethrak lowered his head in shame. "They were not servants, Counselor. They were soldiers. They had been planning this for decades, perhaps longer. They knew our ships better than we did. They controlled systems we did not even understand. When the moment came, we were helpless. Counselor Myra slammed her hand on the table. Then we send the reserve fleet. We have another 1,000 ships in the home territories. We will crush these humans and take back what is ours. I have already contacted the reserve fleet, Zithrak said quietly. The reports are not encouraging. He activated a holographic display. It showed messages from ship captains across the Empire, all reporting the same problem. Human workers were refusing to cooperate. Engines were failing. Navigation systems were locked. Weapons would not fire. The reserve fleet was as crippled as the invasion armada had been. How deep does this go? Counselor Veth demanded. How many humans are there in our military? Zethrak checked his data. Our records show approximately 400 humans in direct military positions. But that number does not include the workers in our shipyards, our training facilities, our supply networks. If we count everyone with access to critical systems, the number could be in the thousands. The council chamber fell silent. For the first time in 12,000 years, the Valkyrie faced an enemy they could not fight. Their ships were useless. Their crews were untrained. Their technology had been turned against them by the very people they had hired to maintain it. On Earth, the mood was very different. Admiral Kevin Price watched the captured Valkyrie fleet from his hospital bed, tears of joy streaming down his wrinkled face. 50 years. He had spent 50 years building this moment, sacrificing everything, watching generations of brave men and women give their lives for a plan they might never see completed. And now it was done. The Valkyrie Armada orbited Earth like a trophy. Thousands of golden warships that now belonged to humanity. The most powerful fleet in the galaxy was under human control. His granddaughter, a young officer named Amy, sat beside his bed. She had served under Lisa Morgan aboard the Eternal Dominion. She had been one of the humans who took control of the bridge. "Grandfather," she said softly, "Commander Morgan is asking to speak with you. She wants to know what our next move should be." Kevin smiled weakly. He was dying. He had known it for months, but he had held on long enough to see his plan succeed. That was enough. "Tell her to contact the Valkyrie High Council," he said. "Offer them terms for surrender. We are not conquerors. We do not want their empire. We want peace and security. Nothing more." Amy nodded and transmitted the message. Lisa Morgan received the order aboard the Eternal Dominion. She was now the highest-ranking human officer in what had once been the Valkyrie invasion fleet. The responsibility weighed heavily on her shoulders, but she was ready. She had been ready her entire life. She recorded a message and sent it to the Valkyrie homeworld. Her voice was calm and professional, showing no anger and no triumph. "This is Commander Lisa Morgan of the United Earth Government, speaking from the bridge of your former flagship. Your invasion fleet has been captured. Your reserve fleet is disabled. Your military is under our control. We did not seek this war. You declared it. We simply responded." She paused, letting her words sink in. "We are not interested in destroying your empire. We are not interested in revenge. We want only to protect our people and secure our borders. I am authorized to offer you terms for peace. Your crews will be returned unharmed. Your ships will remain in our possession as a guarantee of your good behavior. You will accept human observers in all military installations to ensure you never threaten us again." Another pause. "You have 72 hours to respond. If we do not hear from you, we will assume you wish to continue fighting. I promise you, that would be a mistake. You have already lost everything. Do not force us to take more." The message reached the High Council within minutes. The 12 counselors watched it in stunned silence. A human, a worker, a servant, was dictating terms to the rulers of the greatest empire in the galaxy. Counselor Veth was the first to speak. "We cannot accept this. It is humiliation beyond measure. What choice do we have? Counselor Myra replied. Her voice was bitter, but also tired. Our fleet is gone. Our military is compromised. If we refuse, they will come for our home world next. And we have nothing left to stop them. Zethrak stood in the corner, silent and defeated. He had dreamed of glory. He had promised easy victory. Instead, he had led his people into the worst disaster in their history. The council debated for hours, but the outcome was inevitable. They had no options left. The humans had outmaneuvered them completely, not through superior technology or greater numbers, but through patience and planning and a level of dedication the Valkyrie could not understand. They sent their response to Commander Morgan. They would accept negotiations. Lisa read the message and allowed herself a small smile. It was not over yet. There would be months of talks, endless arguments over details, attempts by the Valkyrie to salvage some fragment of their pride. But the war was effectively one dot. She looked out the view screen at Earth, the blue planet she had never visited but always called home. Her grandmother had left that world 50 years ago, knowing she might never return. Her mother had been born in exile, raised as a servant, died still waiting for the mission to succeed. But Lisa would go home. She would walk on Earth's soil, breathe its air, see the oceans and mountains she had only imagined. She would do it as a hero, not a refugee. The long game was finally over, and humanity had won. 6 months after the capture of the Valkyrie fleet, representatives from both species gathered in Geneva to sign a peace treaty. The Great Hall was filled with diplomats, military officers, journalists, and historians. Everyone understood they were witnessing a moment that would change the galaxy forever. Admiral Lisa Morgan stood at the front of the hall, wearing a crisp new uniform decorated with medals she had earned through decades of secret service. Beside her stood Supreme Commander Zethrak, his tall, scaled form bent with shame and defeat. He had been forced to attend by the High Council, made to represent an empire that had lost everything. The treaty documents sat on a table between them. It was simple and direct. The Valkyrie would keep their territory, but their military would be reduced to a small defensive force. Human observers would be stationed at all military facilities. The captured warships would remain under Earth control. Any future disputes would be settled through negotiation, not war. Zethrak picked up the ceremonial pen. His hand trembled slightly. Signing this document meant admitting defeat, accepting humiliation, ending 12,000 years of Valkyrie supremacy. But he had no choice. His people had nothing left to fight with. "Before I sign," he said quietly, so only Lisa could hear, "I must know. Was this always your plan? From the very beginning?" Lisa considered the question. She thought of her grandmother Helen, who had arrived in Valkyrie space as a pretend refugee. She thought of her mother Carol, who had spent her entire life pretending to be a loyal servant. She thought of Kevin Price, who had devoted 50 years to a plan he almost did not live to see completed. "We planned for many possibilities," she answered honestly. "We hoped for peace. We prepared for war. When you chose war, we were ready. That is all." Zethrak shook his head slowly. "You deceived us for generations. You pretended to be our servants while plotting our destruction. How can we ever trust humans again?" Lisa met his eyes without flinching. "We never deceived you, Commander. We worked for you honestly. We maintained your ships perfectly. We trained your officers thoroughly. Everything we did well and faithfully. The deception was not ours. You deceived yourselves." "What do you mean?" "You saw us working and assumed we were servants. You saw us obeying and assumed we were weak. You saw us smiling and assumed we were grateful. You never once asked what we were thinking. You never wondered if we had our own plans, our own dreams, our own loyalties. That blindness was your choice, not our trick. Zethric had no answer. He lowered his head and signed the treaty. The scratch of pen on paper echoed through the silent hall. 12,000 years of Volcari dominance ended with that simple sound. The audience erupted in applause. Human diplomats shook hands and embraced. Journalists rushed to capture images of the historic moment. But Lisa did not celebrate. She was thinking of everyone who had sacrificed to make this day possible. Later that evening, she visited Admiral Kevin Price in the hospital. He was very weak now, barely able to speak, but his eyes were still bright and alert. Amy sat beside him, holding his thin hand. "It is done," Lisa told him. "The treaty is signed. We have peace." Kevin smiled. It took great effort, but he managed to whisper a few words. "You did well. All of you. Better than I ever dreamed." Lisa knelt beside his bed. "You made this possible, Admiral. You saw what no one else could see. You believed when everyone else doubted. This victory belongs to you." Kevin shook his head slightly. "It belongs to everyone. To Helen and George and Carol and Daniel. To every human who worked in Volcari space, pretending to be less than they were. To every child who grew up knowing they were soldiers, not servants." He paused, gathering strength. "To you, Lisa, you held the line when it mattered most." Tears streamed down Lisa's face. She had been strong for so long, carrying the weight of generations on her shoulders. Now, finally, she could let herself feel the emotions she had buried. "What happens now?" Amy asked. "The war is over. The Volcari are defeated. What do we do next?" Kevin closed his eyes. "We live," he whispered. "We build. We explore. We become what we were always meant to be. Not servants. Not soldiers. Just humans, free to choose our own future." He died 3 days later, peacefully in his sleep. The funeral was the largest in Earth's history. Leaders from every human colony attended. Even some Volcari diplomats came, paying respect to the man who had orchestrated their defeat. Lisa spoke at the ceremony. She told the story of the long game, of the generations who had sacrificed everything, of the patience and courage that had won an impossible victory. She spoke of Kevin Price's vision and dedication. She spoke of her grandmother and mother and all the others who had never lived to see this day. "We did not win because we were stronger," she said. "We did not win because we were smarter or more advanced or more numerous. We won because we understood something the Volcari never did. We understood that true strength is not measured in weapons or ships or territory. It is measured in patience, in loyalty, in the willingness to sacrifice today for a better tomorrow." She paused, looking out at the crowd. "The Volcari thought we were servants because we did their work. They thought we were weak because we did not fight. They never understood that work can be warfare, that patience can be power, that a smile can hide a sword. They never understood humans." She straightened her shoulders and raised her voice. "Now they do. Now the entire galaxy does. We are not conquerors. We are not destroyers. But we are not victims either. We are humans. We endure. We adapt. We wait. And when the moment comes, we act. Remember that. Remember it forever. Because the galaxy is watching, and it will never underestimate us again." The crowd rose in a standing ovation. Humans from Earth and the colonies, young and old, soldiers and civilians, all united in pride and hope. The war was over. The future was theirs. Lisa Morgan looked up at the stars and smiled. Somewhere out there, her grandmother's spirit was watching. Somewhere out there, all the servants who had actually been soldiers were finally at peace. The long game had ended. Humanity's true story was just beginning.